As I previously mentioned, the QMS is consisted of a set of policies, procedures, and various other controls that set rules for quality management in an organization. But how do you decide which policies and procedures to document and to what level of details? Each clause of the standard specifies if the requirement from that clause needs to be documented or not. So first thing you need to check is whether a document is required by the ISO 9001. If the document is mandatory, you have nothing to think about. You must write it if you want to be compliant with this standard. The ISO 9001 states pretty clearly what needs to be documented by simply saying the organization shall retain documented information of, for example, the results of the management review. These are the mandatory documents and records prescribed by ISO 9001. Scope of the QMS, quality policy, quality objectives and plans to achieve them, the records of training, skills, experience and qualifications, criteria for evaluation and selection of suppliers, monitoring and measuring equipment calibration records, product service requirements review records, records about design and development outputs review, records about design and development inputs, records of design and development controls, records of design and development outputs, design and development changes records, characteristics of the products to be produced and service to be provided, records about customer property, production, service provision, change control records, records of conformity of product service with acceptance criteria, records of non-conforming outputs, monitoring and measurement results, internal audit program, results of the internal audits, results of the management review, results of the corrective actions. And I will explain each and every one of these mandatory documents and records throughout the course. Keep in mind that the standard does not require the organization to document a procedure for every process. However, even when the standard does not explicitly require for something to be documented, it might be useful for your company to have some additional policies and procedures documented. So if the document is not mandatory, you might find yourself puzzled over whether you need to write it or not. And here are several criteria that can help you decide. First, the size of your company. Smaller companies will tend to have fewer documents, so in such a case you should try to avoid writing a procedure for every small process. For example, if you have 20 employees, you don't need 50 documents for your QMS. And of course, if you are a multinational organization with 10,000 employees, writing policies where each policy would have a couple of related procedures, and then for every procedure a couple of working instructions, this approach does make sense. And the second is importance and complexity. The more important and complex a process or activity is, the more likely you will want to write a policy or a procedure to describe it. And this is because you want to make sure that everyone understands how to perform such a process or activity in order to avoid the breakdowns in your operations. And except for certain mandatory documents, the ISO 9001 doesn't specify what kind of documentation is required for operating the QMS, and it's up to the company to document the QMS in the way that it finds the most appropriate. The amount of documentation will vary depending on the size of the company and the complexity of its products and services.